So we can slowly get started. Before we begin, there's some brief housekeeping I'd like to do. We are so excited that so many people registered for this webinar, but with that comes some potential distractions, disruptions, and even potentially a slowed Zoom performance. So to keep things running smoothly, we have adjusted the virtual meeting settings to turn attendees' cameras off and mute microphones. If you have questions for us throughout the presentation, you're welcome to ask them through the Q&A function in Zoom, as staff will be monitoring that throughout the discussion today. That function should be found in the bottom of your Zoom, the bottom toolbar of your Zoom window. If you don't see it, you may have to click on the More button to access it. If we are unable to address your question during the webinar, we will post a written Q&A document within the next several weeks and distribute it broadly. It's also important to note that we are recording this webinar and it will be available for playback on the college's YouTube channel. Additionally, if you require closed captioning for this presentation, that can be turned on by clicking on the captions icon. If that icon is not appearing for you, you may need to click on the More button in order to access the captions option. And with that, I think we can dive right in. My name is Pamela Bialik, Policy Analyst at CRPO.
Hello, I'm Mark Pioro, Deputy Registrar and General Counsel.
Today, we'll be discussing cross-border electronic practice, which is where the therapist and client use communication technology to have therapy sessions in 2 or more different jurisdictions. And those may be provinces, territories, states, or countries. To begin, we'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. Of course, the viewers of this webinar are spread across Ontario and potentially beyond, but the CRPO offices are physically located in Toronto, so the acknowledgement will be focused on that area. We acknowledge the land we are virtually meeting from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We also want to encourage everyone to do some research on the land they reside on and learn about the individual histories of their region. Now I can take you through our agenda today. We'll begin with a few caveats for the discussion before moving into the basics of electronic practice as they apply to cross-border situations. From there, we'll briefly discuss psychotherapy and counseling regulation across Canada. We'll then outline the broad categories of cross-border practice, which include RPs practicing outside Ontario and non-RP cross-border practice with clients in Ontario. We'll take you through some of the specific issues and considerations for engaging in cross-border practice, as well as how to engage in a clinical, ethical, and risk analysis of your cross-border practice. As I mentioned, before we delve into the larger discussion, we want to note that this topic has some inherent uncertainty. We can provide you with tools for assessing your individual situation, but cannot solve or assess dilemmas for you in advance. CRPO policies and practices offer only half the picture in a cross-border situation. That is, CRPO cannot speak on behalf of other jurisdictions or speak on behalf of other regulators. To begin, we want to remind you that cross-border practice goes hand in hand with electronic practice in most scenarios. As a result, it's important that registrants keep in mind the standards and policies that are relevant to electronic practice. Of course, I want to note that all standards continue to apply regardless of your location or method of working with clients, but in particular, confidentiality, consent, professional liability insurance, safety planning, record keeping, and use of title are relevant in these cases. Regarding confidentiality, it remains important to ensure both the client and the RP are able to conduct therapy sessions in a secure and confidential place. When working from home or a non-traditional office, all confidentiality expectations remain the same. It would be inappropriate for someone like a family member or a member of the public to have access to the space while you conduct your sessions. This may pose challenges in a cross-border context. For example, if the therapist or client is traveling from their usual location and doesn't have access to the same kind of confidential space. Confidentiality also becomes a concern when an RP is physically crossing borders with their laptop or phones they may use for work. Border agents may request access, which could compromise client confidentiality. Now, there are strategies to mitigate this, for example, using a secure cloud-based service so that client information is not physically stored on electronic devices. In terms of informed consent, it's important that the client understands the platform being used to provide therapy and that registrants must provide information about the technology that will be employed in the course of the therapeutic relationship, in particular, potential risks associated with the technology. Part of the informed consent discussion will address the collection, use, and disclosure of a client's personal health information. This is an opportunity to describe record-keeping practices in light of the registrant's electronic practice. This shouldn't be too much of a change compared with electronic practice within the same jurisdiction. However, if a registrant is changing from an in-person therapy to electronic cross-border practice, again, let's say the therapist or client is traveling temporarily outside Ontario, then the registrant should ensure the client is clear about the therapy platform changes they are consenting to. Related to consent, many clients may have extended health insurance. Clients should be made aware of any potential limitations in coverage. For example, if they are located in one province and their policy does not cover professionals licensed in other provinces. We are aware that in some cases, coverage does extend to professionals based in other provinces. Regarding a registrant's professional liability insurance, it's important to check with your insurer that you're covered for seeing clients virtually in other jurisdictions. While we can't speak on behalf of insurers in our limited observations, providing service within Canada seems to be less of a concern than providing services internationally. Should you be covered under PLI and begin seeing clients in other jurisdictions, it's important that you provide the same level of care and safety planning as you would with a local client. This means understanding crisis response resources local to the client and establishing procedures for safety planning that may include a client's emergency contact in the area they are located, emergency services, crisis lines, child welfare agencies, or other services and agencies. Record keeping is another important factor to consider, particularly if the RP is the one traveling or temporarily outside their typical jurisdiction. It's important that the registrants consider whether they can appropriately and securely store records in a cross-border situation, regardless of whether they use paper or electronic records or even a combination of the two. Finally, regardless of where the client or registrant resides, it's important that a registrant uses the title conferred upon them by the college and that they inform clients that they're registered with CRPO and that CRPO is the organization that sets the rules for and considers complaints about registered psychotherapists. In the cross-border context, it may be helpful to clarify that the RP title and CRPO are both Ontario-based, as that may not be clear to a non-Ontario audience. Now I'm going to briefly go over the current regulatory landscape in Canada. I want to emphasize that this is accurate as of today, September 10th, 2024, and is subject to change. It is the ultimate responsibility of registrants to monitor developments in jurisdictions they may have clients in to ensure they remain in compliance with local or regional restrictions. As of today, Newfoundland and Labrador, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut do not have a regulatory college for psychotherapists or counseling therapists. We can't speak to whether or not these provinces and territories intend to regulate or are looking to regulate the profession. Even if a province or territory does not regulate the profession, there may still be restrictions on the titles one can use or the healthcare procedures one may perform, or even rules about business operations. Meanwhile, PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and of course Ontario all regulate either psychotherapy or counseling therapy. If you intend to take on clients in any of these jurisdictions, you need to find out how they handle externally regulated professionals working in their jurisdiction. We also want to note that Alberta and British Columbia are both in the process of regulating the profession. This means their governments have signaled an intent or began working on the process to establish psychotherapy, counseling therapy, or clinical counseling regulation. We don't have dates yet for when these changes are expected to take place, so registrants working in these provinces need to stay up to date on the changes and process to ensure they can remain compliant. Now, we'll take you through some of the broad categories of questions we receive. We'll start with scenarios where the registrant remains in Ontario, but the client is located elsewhere. We are frequently asked by registrants if they are able to work with or see clients in a specific jurisdiction permanently, or if they are able to continue seeing their client who is on vacation in a specific jurisdiction, or perhaps going away for school. CRPO's cross-border tool states the following about these situations. The registrant must consider whether there are any restrictions in the client's jurisdiction on the registrant's ability to provide services to the client. For example, is there a restricted title the registrant cannot use or advertise in the client's jurisdiction without being registered there? Is there a restricted practice or controlled act the registrant cannot perform in the client's jurisdiction without being registered there? This might be similar to the controlled act of psychotherapy, which exists in Ontario that only certain regulated professionals in the province may perform. Additional considerations may include whether the client normally resides in Ontario and is only temporarily out of province, how often the registrant provides services to out-of-province clients, and whether the registrant is specifically advertising to clients in a particular jurisdiction outside Ontario. Registrants are advised to obtain legal advice or contact the regulator in the jurisdiction in which the client resides to develop an understanding of any requirements that may apply. We would also add a reminder not to assume that two different jurisdictions take the same stance. For example, some might restrict the title psychotherapist, others counseling therapist, or clinical counselor. Now, you may be wondering, what happens if the RP is outside Ontario and their clients are in Ontario? We often receive questions on the topic of whether a registrant can continue to see clients when the registrant is permanently or temporarily outside Ontario. CRPO has no requirement for an Ontario residency. This means the college does not have a problem with RPs living somewhere other than Ontario. It's important to note that all the same requirements apply, however. These include using the title that was conferred by CRPO in accordance with the professional practice standards, upholding the code of ethics and abiding by the professional practice standards, engaging in the annual renewal process, which includes providing updated information and paying the annual registration fee, maintaining professional liability insurance, engaging in the quality assurance program, and responding appropriately to communications from the college where it is necessary to do so. Registrants of CRPO who practice in another jurisdiction must be able to comply with the laws where they are located in addition to the requirements from CRPO. If both the client and RP are outside Ontario, you can do the same regarding both the RPs and the client's jurisdiction. Now, most of the attendees at this webinar are RPs. However, it is also helpful to talk about non-RPs practicing in Ontario. One reason is because it can give you a sense of how a regulator looks at non-registrants. Again, the way CRPO treats a non-registrant may differ from how another regulator treats a non-registrant engaging in electronic practice with clients in their jurisdiction. Nonetheless, thinking about this can be illustrative. CRPO's cross-border tool states the following in relation to a non-registrant who is not located in Ontario providing services to a client who is physically in Ontario. In Ontario, non-registrants cannot use the title psychotherapist or hold themselves out as a psychotherapist unless they are registrants of one of 5 other Ontario professions that practice psychotherapy. If the registrant uses the title or holds themselves out as a psychotherapist in their home jurisdiction and their connection to Ontario is insignificant, CRPO will not take the position that they are using the title or holding out in Ontario. However, if the therapist's connection to Ontario is substantial, for example, advertising that focuses on Ontario, a significant number of their clients are in Ontario, or the therapist is regularly physically present in Ontario, they would not be able to use the title psychotherapist or hold themselves out as a psychotherapist unless they become registered in Ontario. In addition, non-registrants cannot perform the controlled act of psychotherapy in Ontario. I won't repeat the definition right now, but it is available on our website for anyone interested. The tool goes on to say if a practitioner is a regulated counselor or psychotherapist in another province, territory, state, or country, CRPO will consider this as a mitigating factor. Because the practitioner is already accountable to another regulator, CRPO will generally not take action against that individual for providing infrequent e-therapy to a client who is located in Ontario. That's what the tool says, but I also want to share a recent anecdote. CRPO received information from an RP about a non-registrant offering psychotherapy in Ontario. This non-registrant was not physically located in Ontario. They were registered with another Canadian counseling or therapy regulator. CRPO wrote to them explaining the rules about practice and registration in Ontario, and they were very confused. They were competent, accountable, and not physically in Ontario, so why would CRPO be picking on them? Well, the concern was that on their website, they specifically located a variety of Ontario cities where clients could receive electronic practice. This goes back exactly to what the cross-border tool says, advertising that focuses on Ontario or a significant number of clients are in Ontario. It turned out that CRPO decided that at this time, prosecuting this person would not be a priority use of resources, but it does show you how a line can be crossed in cross-border practice and the importance of not causing unnecessary concern on the part of regulators. And with that, I'll hand it off to Mark to discuss some of the frequently seen issues we've encountered, as well as take you through a clinical, ethical, and risk analysis.
Thank you very much, Pam. And a brief reminder to anyone who joined partway through that a recording will be made available so you can watch the beginning that you might have missed. So let's review briefly. We've gone over the basics of how CRPO standards related to electronic practice can apply in the cross-border context. We've discussed the broad category of situations where RPs are practicing outside Ontario, whether that means the RP is outside or the client is outside or both. And we have covered the broad category where non-RPs have a connection to practice in Ontario. With that basic understanding, we can look at some specific issues and questions. And just to set expectations up front, there are not going to be a lot of clear answers, only suggestions on how to analyze the situation. So first, where does online cross-border therapy take place? Is it the client's location that matters most, or is it the therapist's? Both, or something else? In other words, which rules apply based on who is where? While there is some scholarship and legal decisions on these questions, they are general and not always applicable. Also, we return to our caveat that CRPO can't speak for how other jurisdictions would view the situation. Many jurisdictions focus on the client's location, while, as we'll discuss in a little bit, some focus on the therapist's location. One thing is clear, if you are an RP, the CRPO standards apply regardless of who is where. So if you keep those things in mind, again, the client's location, therapist's location, and CRPO standards, you can anticipate a lot of situations. The next issue or question we receive a lot is about temporary travel. This might include vacations or students leaving for university. Questions about these situations are essentially asking, is there a difference between the therapist or client being in a different location for a relatively short time compared with a more long-term permanent change of location? Unfortunately, we can't answer this in the abstract. However, the tools and principles we are covering today, in particular the clinical, ethical, and risk analysis we'll talk about near the end, should help you analyze and make decisions regarding these kinds of situations. So again, we'll return to this. Other provinces. We receive questions about specific Canadian provinces. We're not going to go through all 12 other jurisdictions in detail, though you've heard a little bit about which ones regulate the profession and which ones don't, but we'll highlight a couple of examples in more depth. For provinces not mentioned, you can contact the applicable regulator or association there if they have one. First, due to geographic proximity, we have, by necessity, some familiarity with the situation in Quebec. We reached out to our colleague at the Order of Psychologists of Quebec, and just a note, the OPQ not only regulates psychologists, but it also issues psychotherapist permits. The system is a little bit different than the one in Ontario. In any event, we asked, can an RP physically located in Ontario provide therapy over the internet to a client physically located in Quebec? The response we received stated, Quebec's legislation allows psychologists and psychotherapists to provide psychotherapy services through electronic means to someone residing in Quebec. We highly recommend that such practitioner remain active as an Ontario licensee and remain insured for liability. They must also inform clients that they can address any complaint to what is now the CPBAO for psychologists in Ontario, or CRPO for RPs, and not to the OPQ. Second, we asked, can an RP physically located in Quebec provide therapy over the internet to a client located in Ontario? The response, if an RP was to come physically in Quebec, they would need to be licensed in Quebec. So, to be clear, I finished relaying the response and I'm about to offer my own observation, namely, it appears the approach in that jurisdiction places relevance on the location of the therapist, perhaps more so than the location of the client. It goes to show how much variety there is on this issue. One jurisdiction's approach may be different from another jurisdiction's. Next, regarding Alberta, as you heard earlier, it is in the process of preparing to regulate counseling therapists. I'm not aware that the titles psychotherapist or counseling therapist are currently restricted there, though they might soon be. They do have a restriction on what's known as a psychosocial intervention. It's not worded in the exact same way as Ontario's controlled active psychotherapy, but it is somewhat similar. It presumably wouldn't restrict every aspect of psychotherapy practice, just a subset of situations, somewhat, again, like Ontario's controlled active psychotherapy. It's also helpful to keep in mind that most counselors and therapists in Alberta are currently unregulated. Regarding BC, likewise, it is in the process of moving toward regulation. I'm not aware of restrictions on the titles psychotherapist or counseling therapist there at the moment, though again, that could change. I'm also not aware of a controlled act of psychotherapy equivalent in BC at the moment. Labor mobility. At a certain point, a regulated health professional's practice might significantly cross borders. To give some obvious examples, the registrant regularly physically travels back and forth between provinces, or they physically maintain two offices, or they have an employer in this other province. The regulated health professional then might choose to register in both provinces as applicable. Labor mobility resulted from an agreement between governments within Canada. It makes it relatively smooth and efficient to get a license to practice the same profession in another province or territory, and that's compared with the initial application process for one's first license. For RPs, labor mobility only applies in 3 other provinces at the moment: Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. A brief note that my understanding is that the Quebec psychotherapist permit falls under different rules. Please contact OPQ for more information about how to apply. Also, while we can't say for certain, we presume that once BC and Alberta begin regulating counseling therapists, CRPO will accept their registrants via labor mobility. And also, presumably, we hope that RPs will be able to obtain a license there using labor mobility. Please note, having a license in a second province does mean applying, paying the fees for both, and following the rules for both, unless you decide to give up one of the two. In other words, it's not automatic. Tax. CRPO does not provide tax advice. As you may very well know, recently supplies of qualifying psychotherapy and counseling therapy services have become exempt from GST/HST. This potentially makes things a bit simpler. My rough understanding is if a client is located in any Canadian jurisdiction that only charges GST or HST, then that GST HST exemption continues to apply. However, if a province charges PST, provincial sales tax, there might be a little bit of extra research needed as to whether one's psychotherapy services are exempt in that province or whether PST must be collected and remitted. Again, registrants need to consult with their tax advisors for guidance. We can't provide the answers. And also, once you're talking about moving beyond Canadian borders, then you potentially get into income tax issues, which are, again, are beyond the scope of what CRPO can advise on. But that does segue into immigration status, which is another area where we can only point out risks and urge registrants to obtain their own advice. If physically traveling to another country, there are notable risks and considerations If you're considering engaging in any type of work while physically there, advice is necessary since the implications would differ depending on the country's rules, your citizenship, immigration, or visitor status there, and the nature of the work undertaken, including the location of clients. If you are a citizen of this other country and you physically go there, you are presumably allowed to work there, though please verify this for yourself. There might be additional steps, social insurance, social security, or those types of equivalents. So, but to a large extent with citizenship, this aspect is largely taken care of. However, all the other considerations we're talking about today, insurance, confidentiality, tax, etc., they continue to apply. In other words, citizenship and immigration status is only one piece of the overall puzzle. And that in turn transitions nicely into the issue of local laws. To some extent, we have been focusing the discussion so far on licensing, or in other words, whether you need to register with a psychotherapy or counseling regulator in another jurisdiction, or whether that jurisdiction is unregulated. However, there are a variety of other laws beyond regulation and licensing that might apply depending on where the therapist or client are located. These laws can cover many topics: registering a business, operating out of a certain office location, consent to healthcare, reporting a child in need of protection, and so on. A major example is health information privacy. The issue of which rules apply and what those rules are is very complex. If you look at multinational businesses that operate online and you look at their data and privacy fine print, you might find very long documents that aim to satisfy the data privacy rules and restrictions in many provinces, states, or countries. That is all to say that advice would be needed to ensure that a business can comply with different sets of rules that might be triggered depending on where they or their clients are. Continuing on with additional specific issues that come up, the next one is about practicums and supervision. At this point, I want to thank everyone for their patience throughout this webinar, but especially with this topic, as there are a lot of permutations and variations. There are going to be a lot of ifs. If the person is an RP or a student or a supervisor, if they are in Ontario, or if the client is in Ontario, etc., that quickly adds up to a lot of possible scenarios. So thanks again for bearing with us. If you've missed anything, you can again watch the webinar on replay once it is posted, or consult our website for written materials. So regarding practicums and supervision, this issue adds another dimension. In addition to previous considerations around the location of the client and therapist, we also now need to think about the location of the supervisor, as well as the needs to meet CRPO's registration requirements. So students can complete a practicum outside Ontario and still apply to CRPO. CRPO does not have any specific requirements for applicants to complete their practicums in Ontario. There is also no requirement for applicants or registrants to live or work in Ontario at any time. Clinical experience hours for CRPO registration can be completed anywhere in the world. All the same guidance applies about liability insurance and not practicing illegally in another location. Regarding supervisors and supervision, if the supervisor of an RP is located in Ontario, and that's regardless of the location of the supervisee, the supervisor must meet CRPO's criteria to serve as a clinical supervisor in Ontario. For background, CRPO has requirements for supervisors in Ontario and requirements for supervisors outside Ontario. And that is to be a bit flexible and fair to those outside Ontario who might not be familiar with the Ontario requirements. So the in-Ontario requirements include demonstrating competence in providing clinical supervision, for example, having completed a supervision course. An RP can also receive supervision from a supervisor outside Ontario, again, regardless of the location of the supervisee. If the supervisor is located outside Ontario, the supervisor must meet CRPO's criteria for an outside Ontario supervisor, which, like I said, is a bit more flexible. They need to be an experienced practitioner of psychotherapy, qualified to provide clinical supervision in their jurisdiction, generally by being registered with a regulator in a regulated jurisdiction or a professional association in an unregulated jurisdiction. Also, a few words about access to the controlled active psychotherapy. Normally, before a student joins CRPO as a qualifying registrant, they require an RP supervisor in order for the unregulated student trainee to be able to perform the controlled active psychotherapy in Ontario. If the supervisee is an unregulated student in Ontario providing psychotherapy to a client in Ontario, the supervisee may only perform the controlled active psychotherapy if they are receiving supervision from an RP. To say the same thing in a slightly different way, if the supervisee is an unregulated student in Ontario providing psychotherapy to a client in Ontario, the supervisee would not be permitted to perform the controlled active psychotherapy if their supervisor is not an RP. Once the student becomes a qualifying registrant with CRPO toward the very end of their education program, they have more flexibility as to who to receive supervision from. They can receive supervision from someone in Ontario or outside Ontario, from an RP, or from a psychotherapist from a different professional body. Cruise ships. This was an interesting one. I did some very informal research as we have been asked about this, and I was struck by the complexity of whose rules apply. For example, it can depend on the flag of the ship, the departure port, the location of the ship, the terms of the passenger ticket, ports of call, and international conventions. Suffice it to say, we are not going to be able to answer this specifically, and it does sound a little bit fraught and risk involving some risks. However, again, whether it is the therapist or client on the cruise, we're going to talk about how to analyze the situation. Multi-jurisdiction joint clients. So far, we have been talking about individual clients for simplicity, but we've also been asked about couples and families, especially where some of the individual members are in different jurisdictions from one another or from the therapist. This does make things slightly more complicated. However, fundamentally, the analysis is the same. You just need to do it for each individual separately. Are they in a confidential space? Are there any concerns with their geographic location? Will my insurance cover it, etc.? Now I'll mention employee assistance programs and online platforms briefly. Oftentimes, a therapist has some control over which clients to advertise to and to accept, for example, by operating a solo private practice. But if the therapist contracts with an EAP, an online therapy delivery platform, or potentially any other organization or employer, they may have less control. They may have online clients referred to them from a central source within the larger organization. The main point here for today's purposes is quite simple. It is that RPs have a responsibility to carry out due diligence about any cross-border practice issues. Compared with a solo private practice, that due diligence is moved up front to some extent. That is, when considering such a role with an EAP or a platform, read about or talk to the organization. A reputable organization should be able to clearly explain to the RP and to clients whether and how it will make services available inside or outside Ontario, and who is assigned to who within the organization. In contrast, an unscrupulous platform might be a lot less clear about where clients are coming from, how the therapist's services will be advertised, and the reasons for those decisions. So, We have covered general principles, and we have discussed some special categories of situations. But what if you are still uncertain about your practice or a situation you have recently encountered? Rather than think in the abstract about ambiguous general ideas, it's helpful to apply a clinical, ethical, and risk analysis to the situation. Clinical analysis is simply the work you do every day. Assess a client's situation and determine what is indicated or counterindicated. To provide a simple cross-border example, let's say your client has moved to attend university outside Ontario. Are the issues they are now experiencing best suited to your services? Or might they be better suited with a referral to someone else, for example, a service available through their university? Ethical analysis involves applying ethical principles to a situation. There are many tools and frameworks available in the healthcare context. Links to a couple examples are on the slide. Again, to give a simple cross-border example, consider a client who unexpectedly starts their scheduled online session from a completely different location, and it is revealed different jurisdiction, and who is in crisis. Perhaps the principle of doing no harm requires some time to sort out the situation, regardless of the surprise change of jurisdiction. Once things are more settled and safer, you can inform the client that you need to shift toward your usual cross-border policy. Risk analysis can be part of ethical analysis, but it's also worth drawing separate attention to it. Risk analysis weighs the likelihood and severity of uncertain future events, whether those events happen to the client or to you as therapist. Again, to give a cross-border example, let's say you're setting up or reviewing the parameters of your online practice. You speak with a lawyer, accountant, and clinical supervisor or consultant. You contact your insurance representative. You weigh some of the uncertainties they share with you about taking on clients in certain jurisdictions. You conclude that it is too risky to take on clients from a certain category of jurisdictions, while for others, the risk is relatively low and acceptable. With apologies for being very general, CRPO is not making this conclusion for you. You might take a very cautious approach and entirely restrict your practice to Ontario. I've personally seen this approach taken online. It's safe, it's simple, even if it's a bit limiting. Or your approach might be Ontario plus some exceptional circumstances. For example, like I said, around emergencies or very transient travel by yourself or the client, as long as all the other provisions are made to meet the standards. Or you might adopt a jurisdiction-specific approach where you predetermine that you are comfortable taking on clients in some jurisdictions, but not others. Perhaps that is because the rules are straightforward to comply with, or maybe they don't require registration with a psychotherapy college, or maybe they have a college and you are registered with that college in that other jurisdiction. Finally, you may find a way to arrange your business in such a way as to mitigate as many risks as possible from taking on clients from a broad range of jurisdictions. But quite frankly, the more jurisdictions we're talking about, the riskier it becomes. I would be less concerned and less surprised, let's say, if an RP offers educational services, educational programs, or professional consultation in a broader range of jurisdictions, but more concerned, given the higher risks, if they were offering psychotherapy to clients anywhere. Are they really aware of all the applicable laws? Can they perform adequate safety planning given the jurisdictional context? Do they have the required insurance coverage, etc.? Again, we're not advising you on what approach to take. And we are at the closing. We have covered a lot of information, and we hope that it has been helpful and applicable to your situation. To review, we have defined cross-border electronic practice. explained how basic standards around electronic practice might apply in a cross-border situation. We described the main categories of cross-border practice, namely RPs practicing outside Ontario and non-RPs practicing in Ontario. We then pointed out some special cases that have come up regularly in our experience, and finally suggested how you might apply a clinical, ethical, and risk analysis to situations you may encounter or to your practice more broadly, and always keeping in mind the inherent uncertainty at play. We remind attendees to consult the many resources available on our website on this topic. And we have also aimed to integrate and answer as many of the questions that we received. Questions we couldn't get to during this webinar, we will aim to answer in a document we send out within a few weeks. We will also publish the slides and a recording of the webinar. Thank you very much and have a good day.